The day began under a golden sun, its warmth casting a tranquil glow over the Sea of Galilee. After days of walking from town to town, healing the sick and teaching the crowds, the disciples felt weary but fulfilled. Jesus had spoken words that pierced the hearts of many, and they had witnessed miracles that none could explain. Today the people had been fed with a mere 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, yet thousands had eaten their fill. The disciples were in awe, their spirits soaring, marveling at the wonders performed before their eyes. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Jesus, sensing the weariness in his followers, urged them to get into the boat and sail to the other side of the lake. "I will join you later," he said. "I must go and pray." The disciples, though confused by his choice to stay behind, obeyed without question. They had come to trust him with all their hearts, knowing that his wisdom was far beyond their understanding. The boat pushed off from the shore, gliding over the still waters as the disciples rowed. For the first part of the journey, their conversation was light, filled with laughter and joy, the day's miracles still fresh in their minds. The water was calm, the breeze gentle, and it felt like they were floating through a dream. The orange and purple hues of the sunset reflected on the surface of the water, painting a scene of peace and serenity. But that peace was not to last. As night fell, the wind began to change. What had been a light breeze now grew stronger, sending ripples across the water. Dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, slowly at first, but then with alarming speed. The disciples exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter fading as they watched the sky turn from soft twilight to a deep, ominous black. Peter, always the first to speak his mind, stood up, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This doesn't look good," he muttered, gripping the side of the boat. "The storm's coming fast." The wind picked up, howling through the air and making the boat sway. The gentle ripples turned into sharp waves, slapping against the sides of the boat with increasing force. The disciples, experienced fishermen though many of them were, could feel the danger building. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. "We need to prepare," Andrew called out, his voice rising above the growing wind. "Pull in the sails." The disciples scrambled to secure the boat, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, but even as they worked, the storm descended upon them. The clouds thickened, blotting out the moon and stars, plunging them into darkness. The wind roared, whipping through their hair and clothes, and the sea churned beneath them. Waves, now towering like mountains, crashed against the boat, sending cold sprays of salt water into their faces. "Row harder," Peter shouted, gripping the tiller, his knuckles white. "We have to keep the boat steady." But no matter how hard they rowed, the storm only grew stronger. The waves tossed the boat around like a toy, threatening to capsize it with every crash. Water poured into the boat faster than they could bail it out, and panic began to creep into their hearts. This was no ordinary storm. It was fierce and relentless, as though the sea itself was trying to swallow them whole. John, normally calm and composed, was the first to let his fears show. "We're going to drown," he cried, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "This storm is too strong." The others echoed his fear, their eyes wide with terror as the boat lurched violently. It felt as though the very foundations of the earth were shaking beneath them. The storm was all-consuming, a force far greater than any of them had ever faced. In the midst of their panic, Peter's gaze fell on the back of the boat, where Jesus lay sleeping on a cushion, his face peaceful, completely unaffected by the chaos surrounding them. Peter's heart raced, torn between disbelief and desperation. How could he sleep at a time like this? Did he not care that they were perishing? With a surge of emotion, Peter let go of the tiller and stumbled toward Jesus, grabbing him by the shoulder and shaking him awake. "Master," Peter shouted, his voice breaking, "don't you care that we're about to drown?" The disciples turned to Jesus, their eyes pleading, their faces filled with fear and exhaustion. They had followed him for so long, trusted him with everything, yet now, in the face of this overwhelming storm, they felt abandoned, as if he had left them to face the storm alone. Jesus stirred, slowly opening his eyes, his expression serene and untroubled. He rose to his feet, steady despite the boat's violent rocking. He looked around at his disciples, their faces pale and drenched with both rain and fear. His gaze then shifted to the raging sea, to the wind and the waves that threatened to consume them. Without a trace of fear or hesitation, Jesus raised his hand toward the heavens and spoke with a calm authority that cut through the storm like a sword through darkness. "Peace," he commanded, his voice firm yet gentle. "Be still." In an instant the wind ceased. The waves, once towering and ferocious, smoothed out, becoming as gentle as a child's breath. The rain stopped and the clouds parted, revealing the moon and stars shining brightly once more. The sea, which had moments before seemed like a monster ready to devour them, was now calm and serene, as if the storm had never existed. The disciples stood frozen, their mouths agape, their hearts still racing. They looked around in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The storm, the terrifying, life-threatening storm, was gone, vanished with a single word from Jesus. Jesus turned to them, his eyes filled with a love deeper than they could fathom, yet his voice carried a quiet rebuke. "Why are you so afraid?" he asked, his tone gentle yet piercing. "Do you still have no faith?" The disciples, still shaken, said nothing. How could they explain their fear in the face of such power? How could they express the awe and wonder that now filled their hearts? They had seen miracles before, but this was something beyond anything they could have imagined. Jesus, seeing their silence, sat down in the boat, his gaze softening as he prepared to give them wisdom that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "Let me tell you a story," he began, his voice calm and steady, the way a father speaks to his children after a long day. "There was once a great king, a wise and powerful ruler, who had everything a man could want. His kingdom was vast, his subjects were loyal, and his palace was the grandest in all the land. But despite all this, the king had one great fear: storms." The disciples listened, captivated, as Jesus spoke, the terror of the storm slowly fading as his words filled the air. You see, the king had seen how storms could rise suddenly and destroy everything in their path. He had seen villages washed away, crops ruined, and lives lost. So whenever a storm would approach, the king would retreat to his highest tower, locking himself away, hoping that the storm would pass without harm. He believed that his palace, with its strong walls and high towers, would keep him safe. But one night, a storm came like none he had ever seen. The winds howled, the rain poured down in torrents, and the walls of his palace shook. The king, trembling with fear, locked himself in his tower, certain that his kingdom would be destroyed. But in the midst of the storm, an old servant, wise beyond his years, came to the king and said, "Your Majesty, come with me. I know a place where you will be safe." Desperate for protection, the king followed the servant down to the harbor. There, in the raging storm, was a small, simple boat. The king hesitated, looking at the tiny vessel in disbelief. "This boat?" he asked. "How can this small boat protect me from such a great storm?" The servant smiled and said, "It is not the boat that will save you, my king. It is your faith. Step into the boat and trust that it will carry you through the storm." The king, though afraid, climbed into the boat. The waves crashed around them, the wind whipped at their faces, but the boat remained steady. Though it rocked and swayed, it did not sink. As the night wore on, the king's fear began to fade. He realized that it wasn't the boat that had saved him, it was the faith he had found within himself. By morning, the storm had passed, and the king knew that storms would come again, but he no longer feared them. He had learned that faith is what carries us through. Jesus paused, letting the story sink in, his eyes resting on each of his disciples. "You see," he said softly, "life will bring storms, some small, some great. There will be times when the waves threaten to overwhelm you, and the wind seems too strong to bear. But faith is the boat that will carry you through. It may not prevent the storm, but it will keep you steady in the midst of it." The disciples listened in silence, their hearts heavy with the realization of their own fear and doubt. They had followed Jesus for so long, seen his miracles, heard his teachings, and yet, when faced with the storm, they had doubted his power. They had let fear overtake their faith. Peter, always the one to speak first, broke the silence, his voice filled with emotion. "Master, we were so afraid. We thought the storm would destroy us." Jesus looked at him with compassion, his hand resting on Peter's shoulder. "Fear is natural, Peter," he said gently, "but faith is your anchor. It is what keeps you from being swept away by the storms of life. Trust in me and trust in the Father. You will face many more storms, but with faith, you will never face them alone." Tears filled Peter's eyes as he nodded, the weight of Jesus' words settling deep in his heart. The other disciples too felt the power of his message, their fear giving way to a sense of peace they had never known before. As they continued their journey across the now calm sea, the disciples knew that this night would stay with them forever. They had faced the storm not just on the water but within their own hearts, and they had learned a lesson that would carry them through the rest of their lives. From that moment on, no matter what challenges or trials life would bring, the disciples knew they had a steady boat, faith in Jesus, the one who could calm the storm and bring peace to their hearts. And in that faith, they found the strength to face any storm that would come their way. The boat sailed smoothly through the night, guided by the steady hand of faith, and the disciples knew that as long as they stayed close to Jesus, no storm, no matter how fierce, could ever truly harm them. For their faith was their steady boat, and in it they would always find peace. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.